August 1942, Volga River, Soviet Union. The suffocating heat of the Russian steppes brought more than just summer. It brought the omen of an apocalypse. Under the scorching sun that transformed the horizon into a shimmering mirage, 300,000 men marched toward their destiny. They didn't know it yet, but they were crossing the gates of hell. Their destination had a name: Stalingrad. For Adolf Hitler, it was just a point on the map. A strategic objective to cut the supply arteries of the Soviet Union and conquer the Caucasus oil fields. But for the soldiers marching under the dust that filled their lungs, for the civilians who still inhabited that vibrant city of 600,000 souls, Stalingrad was about to transform into something very different. It would become the place where modern warfare would lose its sanity. The story of Stalingrad doesn't begin in its ruins. It begins in the frozen mud and frustration of Moscow in the winter of 1941. The Wehrmacht, the powerful war machine that had crushed Poland in weeks and humiliated France in months, had encountered its first insurmountable obstacle: General Winter. At the gates of Moscow, as the snow fell relentlessly and German tanks froze in their positions, the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crack. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, came to a desperate conclusion. Germany could not win a war of pure attrition against the Soviet giant. It needed to suffocate it, cut its arteries, drain its black blood. Oil. If we don't secure the oil of Baku, we will have to end the war. These words from the Führer to General Friedrich Paulus sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. Thus was born Operation Fall Blau, Operation Blue, a colossal pincer movement to conquer the Caucasus. But there was a problem, a single point that needed to be neutralized to protect the northern flank of the offensive. An industrial city on the banks of the Volga. A city that had the audacity to bear the Soviet dictator's name: Stalingrad. The roar of Panzer III and IV engines echoes across the infinite steppes. The German Sixth Army, the most powerful unit of the entire Wehrmacht, advances like a wave of steel and iron. Leading them, General Friedrich Paulus, meticulous, elegant, chronically indecisive, a man of maps and spreadsheets who had never commanded an army in the field of battle. He was the perfect bureaucrat for Hitler, obedient, incapable of challenging superior orders even when they defied logic. Under the Russian summer sun, the advance is spectacular. Soviet divisions, still bleeding from Stalin's purges, are encircled and annihilated before they can even organize. Dust clouds so dense cover the German columns that soldiers must tie cloths over their faces to avoid suffocating. It's blitzkrieg in its purest form. Lightning war, fast, brutal, definitive. But beneath the shine of medals and conquered maps, cracks begin to appear. German logistics, still dependent on 600,000 horses to transport supplies, cannot keep up with tanks advancing 50 kilometers per day. Fuel becomes scarce. Supply wagons fall behind, trapped in dust and irregular terrain. And then Hitler commits his first fatal error. In a fit of impatience and megalomania, he divides his forces. The 4th Panzer Army is diverted to the Caucasus, then brought back to support Paulus, then sent south again. A chaotic back and forth that wastes precious weeks of fuel and time. Time that allows the Soviets to fortify Stalingrad. In Moscow, the climate is one of absolute panic. Stalin knows that losing Stalingrad would mean the collapse of oil and food supplies to the north. On July 28, 1942, he issues an order that would forever change the character of the battle. 3 words that would become legend: not one step back. From that moment on, any soldier who retreated without express orders would be considered a traitor. Special NKVD detachments are positioned in the rear, not to fight the Germans, but to shoot their own men who tried to flee. Stalingrad ceases to be a strategic objective. It becomes a matter of life or death, an altar of sacrifice. The man chosen to command the defense of the city is General Vasily Chuikov, rough, relentless, prone to fits of rage. He is the polar opposite of Paulus. While the German relies on long-range tactics and technical superiority, Chuikov prepares something different. He will transform Stalingrad into a nightmare the Germans never imagined. August 23rd, 1942. 4:00 p.m. The drone of engines comes from the west. First one, then 10, then hundreds. The sky over Stalingrad darkens with the shadow of more than 600 bombers, Stukas and Heinkel 111s. Luftwaffe 4, under the command of the relentless General Wolfram von Richthofen, received orders to turn the city to dust. What happens in the following hours is not a battle. It's an apocalypse. Thousands of tons of incendiary and explosive bombs are dumped on a civilian population that was not evacuated. The explosions are so intense they create a firestorm. Air is sucked from streets and basements, feeding flames that reach hundreds of meters high. The asphalt on the avenues melts. The gigantic oil storage tanks on the banks of the Volga explode, pouring a sea of fire into the river. The sky turns black. Day transforms into artificial night. The smell of burning flesh mixes with brick dust and the acrid smoke of burning oil. Thousands of civilians die, buried alive or burned. When the dust finally begins to settle and the fires diminish, Stalingrad no longer exists. What remains are concrete skeletons, infinite mountains of bricks and twisted iron, smoking craters where there were once squares and parks. For the German commanders, watching from their observation posts, the conclusion seems obvious. The city is dead. Victory is just a matter of a parade. But the bombing had unwittingly created something unexpected. Every destroyed building, every bomb crater, every cracked wall and every collapsed basement had become the perfect terrain for the defender. A three-dimensional labyrinth of death where tanks were useless and air superiority meant nothing. Paulus orders his infantry divisions to enter the city for the final cleanup. As they cross the destroyed suburbs and enter what remained of the industrial center, the German soldiers, accustomed to the quick victories of blitzkrieg, perceive something disturbing. The silence. A heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the ruins. The buildings appear dead, the streets deserted, and then from the shadows, from holes in the walls, from dark basements, the first shots echo. The Soviets hadn't fled, they were waiting. The term is born there, in the first weeks of September 1942, Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. German soldiers quickly discover that all their advantages, heavy artillery, tank coordination, air supremacy, become irrelevant in the ruins of Stalingrad. General Chuikov implemented a diabolical tactic. He ordered his troops to hug the enemy. Soviet positions are maintained at grenade-throwing distance from German lines, often just 15 or 20 meters. This proximity creates an impossible dilemma. If Paulus orders artillery bombardment, he will massacre his own men. The Luftwaffe, which once dominated the skies, watches helplessly. Its pilots cannot distinguish friendly positions from enemy ones. The war of maps and maneuvers is replaced by the war of rooms. Control of a kitchen is worth more than a square. A staircase becomes the day's objective. A basement can consume an entire company. The grain silo. The first circle of hell. One of the first and most brutal examples of this new reality is the battle for the grain silo, a massive concrete structure in the south of the city. For the Germans of the 94th Infantry Division, it seems like an impregnable fortress occupied by hundreds of enemies. Inside, the scene is Dantesque. The wheat burns slowly, creating acrid, suffocating smoke that fills the combatants' lungs. The fight lasts entire days and is fought in almost total darkness, illuminated only by the flashes of explosions and submachine gun fire ricocheting off concrete walls. German soldiers describe in their diaries the shock of facing men who do not surrender, even when surrounded by flames and without water for 48 hours. When the silo finally falls, the Germans expect to find an entire regiment. Instead, they find only a handful of Soviet naval infantrymen, fewer than 20 men, exhausted, covered in blood and soot, who had held entire divisions with little more than rifles and willpower. But the true heart of darkness was in the center of the city. Mamayev-Kurgan Hill, known on German maps as Height 102. Whoever controlled that 102-meter-high hill would control the panoramic view of the entire city and the Volga, would control artillery fire, would control the fate of the battle. The hill changed hands dozens of times. The bombardment was so constant that the soil, originally green, turned grey due to pulverization of the earth. In the following winter, snow could not accumulate on top. The ground was constantly heated by explosions. Thousands of soldiers on both sides died there. After the war, it was discovered that the soil of Mamayev-Kurgan contained between 500 and 1,000 metal fragments per square meter. The ground was literally made of steel and lead, an eternal scar of violence. German soldiers who fought there described the sound as something inhuman, not just the thunder of explosions, but a constant roar that penetrated the bones, a noise that never stopped and that destroyed the ability to think. In the city center, a simple 4-story apartment building became a legend. Under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, a small group of soldiers, fewer than 30 men, transformed the building into a fortress. They surrounded the building with mines and barbed wire, mounted machine guns in every window and hole in the wall, dug underground trenches for communication. The Germans launched daily attacks for almost 2 months. They used tanks, artillery, flamethrowers. But the defenders resisted. On Paulus's personal map, the house was marked as Festung, fortress. It is said that the Soviets held the building for 58 days, longer than it took the Wehrmacht to conquer all of France. Pavlov and his men lived like rats. They slept in the basement during the day, fought on the upper floors at night. They ate rations that came through underground trenches. They drank rainwater that accumulated in bomb craters, and they never surrendered. North of Stalingrad were the industrial complexes that were the pride of the Soviet Union: the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi, and the Red October. They weren't just factories. They were cities of steel and concrete, labyrinths of gigantic boilers, mechanical lathes, industrial furnaces, and piles of scrap. And it was there that the battle reached levels of absolute surrealism. Soviet workers continued to assemble T-34 tanks while German bombs fell on the glass roofs. The tanks left the assembly line without paint, often without telescopic sights, and were driven by the workers themselves, men in work overalls, not military uniforms, directly into combat against the panzers battering at the gates. The sound was deafening. Metal ricocheting on metal, the grinding of machines mixed with the thunder of explosions. Each mechanical lathe, each boiler, each support pillar was a shelter for a Soviet shooter. The Germans were forced to use flamethrowers to clear each room, but as soon as the fire died down and they advanced, the Russians emerged from service tunnels, underground maintenance networks that connected the entire complex, and retook the positions. It was a macabre game of cat and mouse that repeated infinitely. But while the factories roared with the sound of metal and explosions, there was another kind of war happening in Stalingrad. A war of silence, of patience, of psychological terror. The war of snipers. Names like Vasily Zaitsev became symbols of terror for the German soldier. The sniper was not just a soldier with a telescopic sight, he was a psychological weapon. The presence of snipers meant that a German soldier could do nothing, eat, sleep, fetch water, or even urinate, without the risk of a bullet piercing his skull. Officers were the preferred targets. A platoon commander could be giving orders to his men one moment, and the next be lying on the ground, a perfectly circular hole in his forehead. The morale of the Sixth Army began to shatter under this invisible pressure. Soldiers developed what German doctors called tunnel vision, a psychological condition where a man could only look forward, unable to turn his head for fear of exposing his profile. The legend of the duel between Zaitsev and the alleged German Major Erwin König, whose existence is debated by historians, reflects this obsessive human hunt that took place in the shadows of the ruined buildings. For the Soviets, the Volga River was at once their only salvation and their greatest cemetery. Without supplies coming from the eastern bank, the resistance would collapse in hours. But crossing those waters under German fire was passing through a gate of hell. Every night, under the ghostly light of German flares, hundreds of barges crossed the river bringing food, ammunition, and thousands of young recruits, many of whom had never held a rifle before. The Luftwaffe focused all its attention on these crossings. The Volga was dotted with sinking boats, floating bodies, men struggling against the icy waters while being machine-gunned by Stukas diving from the clouds. The life expectancy of a Soviet soldier newly arrived on the western bank was 24 hours. One day, sometimes less. Those who survived the landing were immediately thrown into the meat grinder of the ruins, often without even knowing where they were or who was beside them. There was no training, there was no time to learn, there was only one order: resist. Late October 1942. Paulus's Sixth Army controls about 90% of the city. At several points, German soldiers managed to reach the banks of the Volga, dividing Soviet forces into small, isolated pockets. Hitler, in his speeches in Munich, proclaims that Stalingrad has been conquered. But the reality on the front line is different. The Germans are exhausted. Their elite divisions have been reduced to ragged combat groups. Uniforms are torn and dirty. Ammunition is prioritized over food. No one has received winter uniforms. After all, the campaign should have ended before the cold arrived. The German soldier, the Lancer, feels that Stalingrad is a monster that never stops eating. With each conquered block, new enemies emerge from basements that had already been cleared. Corpses that seem dead rise to fire one last burst. The optimism of summer has been replaced by a somber apathy. Letters intercepted by censors reveal despair. This is no longer the army that conquered France. We are ghosts fighting in a cemetery. Paulus, focused on capturing the last 10% of the city to satisfy Hitler's obsession, ignores something crucial. Intelligence reports indicating an enormous accumulation of Soviet troops on the flanks. The flanks of the Sixth Army are defended by Romanian and Hungarian armies, poorly equipped, poorly fed, without adequate supplies for the approaching winter. And then the wind changes. The Russian steppes begin to blow the icy air of Siberia. The first ice begins to float in the Volga. Temperatures plummet, and in the darkness beyond the German lines, something colossal is moving. 1 million Soviet soldiers, 1,500 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces. General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky have prepared a trap of biblical proportions. The plan is simple and devastating. Break through the weak flanks defended by Romanians and Hungarians, encircle the entire Sixth Army inside Stalingrad, and crush it. The name of the operation is poetic in its irony: Operation Uranus. The Sixth Army has its head inside the lion's mouth, believing the animal is dead, but the Red Army is not dead. It was just waiting for the right moment. Paulus, in his headquarters, looks at the maps under the faint light of oil lamps. The last 10% of Stalingrad stubbornly resists, but victory is near. He can feel it. What he doesn't know is that in a few hours the world will turn upside down. What he doesn't know is that the hunter is about to become the prey. What he doesn't know is that Stalingrad is not the end of the battle. It's just the beginning. On the frozen steppes to the north and south, tank engines begin to rumble. Thousands of soldiers check their weapons one last time. Artillery is positioned. Commanders synchronize their watches. Stalin in Moscow smiles for the first time in months. Hitler, in his wolf's lair, still hasn't realized he has lost. And the Sixth Army, exhausted and bleeding in the ruins of Stalingrad, is about to discover the true meaning of hell. The siege is about to close. Winter is coming, and it will have no mercy. In the next part of this saga, we will witness Operation Uranus, the devastating counterattack that would change the course of World War II. We will see the desperation of the encircled Paulus, the failure of the Luftwaffe's airlift, the agony of German soldiers freezing in the Stalingrad cauldron. We will see the moment when German hope died in the ice, and the moment when the fate of the war was sealed forever. Don't miss it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because the worst is yet to come.